And three strange questions. Why did tariffs imposed by Donald Trump spark trade wars across the globe? Why is South Korea one of the richest economies in Asia, while North Korea remains one of the poorest? And how can a single Starbucks cafe sometimes generate more revenue in a year than entire communities of coffee farmers in Ethiopia? At first glance, these stories seem completely unrelated. Politics, geography, coffee shops. But in reality, they are connected by the same invisible force, a force that quietly shapes the wealth of nations, determines which countries grow rich and which fall behind. That force is international trade. Trade is often described as the bloodstream of the global economy. Goods move between countries the way blood moves through the human body. If the flow stops, the system weakens.
My fellow citizens, in these challenging times, our nation's strength and stability shine through. We stand united, our resolve unwavering, building a future of prosperity, and together we will prevail.
Factories slow down. Prices rise. Economic growth begins to stall. This is why trade has always been one of the central forces shaping human civilization. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Samuelson once argued that international trade benefits all participants, even when the advantages seem unequal at first glance, because trade allows countries to specialize, and specialization increases productivity. But before we understand why trade is so powerful today, we need to go back thousands of years. Long before global shipping networks, container ports, and international corporations existed, in the earliest human societies, exchange was extremely simple. One tribe might have access to a river full of fish. Another tribe might live in a region rich in wild game. So they traded fish for meat. This system is known as barter. Barter was the earliest form of trade, but it had a serious problem. What happens if the fisherman wants meat, but the hunter doesn't want fish? What if the values of the goods are unclear? How many fish equal one animal? Trade required a way to measure value. So over time, societies began using objects that everyone agreed had value. These objects became early forms of money. In ancient Mesopotamia, barley was sometimes used. In parts of Africa and Asia, shells became a medium of exchange. Salt was so valuable in certain regions that it functioned as currency. In fact, the word salary comes from the Latin word salarium, referring to payments made in salt. But as trade expanded across larger distances, societies needed something more universal, something durable, something rare, something easily divisible. Gold and silver eventually became the preferred solution. For centuries, precious metals served as the foundation of international trade. They were portable, they were widely recognized, and they maintained value across borders. Once gold and silver became central to commerce, another important concept appeared: the trade balance. If a country exported more goods than it imported, gold flowed into that country. If it imported more than it exported, gold flowed out. This simple mechanism began shaping the rise and fall of empires. One of the earliest large-scale trade networks was the Silk Road, a vast system of trade routes connecting China with the Middle East and Europe. Silk traveled west, spices moved across deserts, glass and precious metals moved east. But trade didn't only move goods, it moved ideas, it moved technologies, it moved religions. Buddhism spread from India to China along these routes. New agricultural techniques traveled between civilizations. Even diseases moved along trade routes. The Black Death, which devastated Europe in the 14th century, spread partly through trade connections. Trade has always been a powerful connector of civilizations. But the structure of global trade changed dramatically during the Age of Exploration. European explorers opened sea routes to Asia and the Americas. Trade that once depended on land routes began shifting toward maritime empires. Portugal and Spain dominated early ocean trade. Later, the Netherlands and Britain became major trading powers. During this period, a new economic philosophy emerged. It was known as mercantilism. Mercantilists believed that wealth was measured by the amount of gold a country possessed. In their view, international trade was a competition. Countries needed to export as much as possible and import as little as possible. The goal was simple: bring gold into the country. Avoid sending gold out. Trade was seen almost like a battlefield. But over time, economists began questioning this idea, because something strange kept happening. Countries that traded extensively often became richer together, rather than one side always winning and the other losing. This observation led to one of the most important breakthroughs in economic thought: the theory of comparative advantage. Economists Adam Smith and David Ricardo demonstrated that trade is not a zero-sum game. To understand this idea, imagine two neighbors, Maxime and Alexei. Maxime can bake bread. He can also make shoes. Alexei can also bake bread and make shoes. But Maxime is slightly better at baking bread and significantly better at making shoes. At first glance, it seems logical that Maxime should do everything himself, but economics suggests a different outcome. If Maxime specializes in making shoes and Alexei focuses on baking bread, both can produce more together. They trade. Maxime gets bread. Alexei gets shoes. Both end up better off, even though one person may be more productive overall. This principle applies not only to individuals, but also to entire countries. One country might be better at producing electronics. Another may have natural advantages in agriculture. Another might specialize in financial services. When countries focus on what they do best and trade with others, global productivity increases. But this leads to one of the most surprising paradoxes of modern economics. Some countries export enormous amounts of natural resources, yet remain relatively poor. Why? Because not all exports generate the same value. Take coffee as an example. Farmers in Ethiopia grow coffee beans, but the largest profits often appear later in the supply chain. Branding, packaging, retail experience. Companies like Starbucks sell more than coffee. They sell atmosphere. They sell identity. They sell a brand. The price of a cup of coffee reflects marketing and perception as much as agriculture. The same pattern appears across many industries. A country might export raw timber. Another country turns that timber into furniture, adds design, adds branding, and sells the final product at a much higher price. In global trade, value often accumulates further along the production chain. This is why many countries aim to move from exporting raw materials to exporting technology and manufactured goods. Now let's examine how governments influence trade flows. Two basic terms define international commerce: exports and imports. Exports are goods sold to other countries. Imports are goods purchased from abroad. If a country exports more than it imports, it runs a trade surplus. If it imports more than it exports, it runs a trade deficit. Governments sometimes try to influence this balance through tariffs. A tariff is a tax placed on imported goods. Imagine a country importing televisions from South Korea. If the government introduces a tariff on those TVs, their price increases. Domestic products become more competitive, but tariffs often trigger retaliation. Other countries respond with their own tariffs. This escalation is known as a trade war. Trade wars can disrupt global supply chains and increase costs for consumers. This became visible during the trade conflict between the United States and China in the late 2000s. Tariffs were introduced to protect domestic industries. But many economists argued that the higher costs were ultimately paid by consumers through increased prices.
Good jobs in our own
Trade policy often creates complex ripple effects,
I'd love
but the most powerful forms of trade today are not always physical goods. They are often invisible. Hollywood exports movies around the world. American music dominates global charts. Luxury brands like Louis Vuitton sell status as much as products. Technology companies export software and digital services. These cultural and intellectual exports generate enormous influence. Economists sometimes refer to this phenomenon as soft power, the ability of a country to influence others through culture, ideas, and innovation rather than force. And at the center of this system